At the beginning of the 20th century, China was going through a delicate moment. After centuries under Qing rule, the country was weakened, internally divided, and pressured by foreign powers that gradually stripped away its autonomy. The imperial structure could no longer support the growing population, and the traditional bureaucracy seemed increasingly out of touch with the people's reality. Foreign presence was constant and humiliating. Treaties imposed by force, lost wars, territorial and economic concessions turned China into a stage for international exploitation. Meanwhile, the imperial government proved unable to respond. Corruption corroded the court, and high officials were more concerned with keeping their privileges than with governing effectively. It was in this atmosphere of frustration and revolt that nationalist movements began to gain strength. The people demanded change. Popular uprisings like the Boxer Rebellion had already exposed the growing tension between the people and the empire. But the final spark came in 1911, when a series of organized uprisings turned into the Xinhai Revolution. It not only challenged Qing rule, it called for the complete end of the imperial system. At the center of this political and social storm, the Chinese throne belonged to a boy, an emperor just 2 years old, crowned as a symbol of continuity, but with no real control over events. As the country fell apart, the image of a 1,000-year-old empire was upheld only by appearances and tradition. The end was inevitable. And so, as the world watched the fall of an empire that had lasted over 2,000 years, the story of Puyi, the last emperor of China, began. An unusual destiny for a boy born to rule, but who grew up in a country that no longer wanted to be ruled by anyone. Puyi was only 2.5 years old when placed on the dragon throne. He was far too young to grasp the grandeur of the position, yet already carried the burden of a dying dynasty. The coronation ceremony was lavish, filled with pomp, incense, and age-old rituals, all to maintain the illusion that order still reigned, that China was still ruled as before. But deep down, everyone knew that empire was in its final breaths. Inside the Forbidden City, the young emperor lived isolated from the real world. Surrounded by euphemisms, rigid ceremonies, and a decaying court, he grew up without truly understanding what it meant to be emperor. His education was controlled by eunuchs and conservative tutors, who treated him as a living deity. But Puyi's authority never extended beyond the palace walls. Outside, the country was already moving in a different direction. In 1912, just a few months after his coronation, the throne was officially abolished. The Republican Revolution had won. But through a political agreement, Puyi was allowed to continue living in the Forbidden City, keeping his title in a symbolic form. He was an emperor without an empire. A boy trapped in an empty theater, surrounded by the ghosts of a past that no longer made sense. While the world changed at a rapid pace, Puyi grew up without understanding why his decrees had no effect, why generals no longer sought his blessing, or why his subjects seemed to have vanished. Gradually, reality began to seep through the palace walls. The Son of Heaven had become merely a decorative figure, forgotten by time and politics. That childhood inside a bubble, surrounded by servants and rituals, deeply shaped Puyi's personality. He was not an ordinary child, but neither had he ever truly been an emperor. He was something in between, a living symbol of a vanished empire, raised in a world that no longer existed, and that ambiguity would follow him for the rest of his life. The definitive end of Puyi's world came in 1924. At just 18 years old, he was expelled from the Forbidden City. A military coup led by Feng Yuxiang dissolved the last vestige of imperial protection that kept him in that bubble. In the dead of night, under heavy surveillance, Puyi left behind the gates from which he believed he ruled China's fate. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of freedom, not as a victory, but as abandonment. The palace where he grew up, the rituals, the golden thrones, the red walls, all became the past in a matter of hours. Outside, the world was different, harsher, faster, and there was no place for a former emperor. Puyi went to live in a modest residence, still surrounded by a few loyal followers but without any real power. From son of heaven, he became just another confused young man, trying to understand who he was outside the imperial stage. During this period, he flirted with Western ideas, tried to modernize, studied foreign languages, and read about politics. But all of it happened with a certain disconnect. The boy once treated as a divine being was now trying to live as an ordinary citizen, and failed at every attempt. Ordinary life humiliated him, and modernity left him lost. He still longed for relevance, still dreamed of reclaiming the throne. It was at this point that Puyi began to look toward Japan, a rising military power with a strong interest in China's future. The Japanese saw Puyi as a useful pawn, a legitimate symbol to gain the support of the Chinese people for their expansionist ambitions. And Puyi, in search of purpose, allowed himself to be seduced by the promise of restoration. He believed he could be emperor once again, even if it meant serving foreign interests. This transition from a glorious past to an uncertain present left a deep mark on Puyi. His expulsion from the Forbidden City was not just geographical, it was symbolic. He was forced to confront the emptiness left by the dynasty's fall. And in trying to fill that void, he began down a new path, one that would lead him straight into a dangerous and tragic farce: the throne of Manchukuo. In 1932, Puyi finally wore a crown again, but this time it came with invisible chains. The Japanese had invaded Manchuria in northern China and needed a face to legitimize their occupation. They created the puppet state of Manchukuo and installed Puyi as its head of state. To the outside world, he was an emperor again. In reality, just a puppet. All important decisions came from Tokyo. The Japanese secret police watched his every move. His ministers were supervised, his decrees edited. Puyi tried to convince himself that he still held some authority. He took part in ceremonies, signed documents, wore imperial robes. But behind the palace walls, he knew he was once again putting on a performance, just like when he was a child in the Forbidden City. Only now, the audience was the entire world, and the directors of the show were Japanese generals. The frustration grew silently. Puyi found himself trapped, used as the symbol of an empire that wasn't his. He was forced to collaborate with policies of repression against his own people, while the region's resources were exploited and Manchu identity was distorted for propaganda. The young man who once dreamed of restoring his dynasty now watched what remained of it be destroyed by the very hands that had promised to help him. It's during this period that a remarkable letter emerges. In it, Puyi writes to an old Western tutor, Reginald Johnston, who had guided him in his youth. The letter, written in a restrained, almost cold tone, reveals an exhausted soul. He avoids calling himself a victim, but his words betray the weight of a burden he can no longer bear. He speaks of obligations, isolation, constant surveillance. In a veiled way, he admits he has no real power, and perhaps never did. It wasn't just a personal letter, it was a muffled cry, the confession of a man imprisoned by his own search for meaning. Puyi, the twice-crowned emperor, now realized he had been used, that his image was only valuable as long as it served greater interests, that his throne was nothing more than an empty chair, built on lies. This moment marks the beginning of total disillusionment. The restored empire was just another illusion, and once again, Puyi found himself small before forces he would never control. The letter he wrote at that time remains one of the most honest and tragic documents of his life. A quiet portrait of a man who spent his life trying to be emperor without ever truly being free. The end of World War II, in 1945, completely changed Puyi's fate. The Japanese empire that had placed him on Manchukuo's throne was collapsing. Atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Red Army invaded Manchuria with brutal force. Puyi, who for years believed himself protected by his allies, tried to flee. Dressed as an ordinary Japanese citizen, running through the chaos, he was captured by the Soviets at Shenyang Airport. Taken as a prisoner of war, he spent the following years detained in the Soviet Union. He was no longer an emperor, nor a head of state, not even a symbol. He was just a man in free fall, wrapped in memories of a past that now seemed distant and absurd. During Soviet interrogations, Puyi revealed details of Japan's machinery in Manchukuo, confessing his subordinate role and quiet resentment. The authorities realized he was not a typical war criminal. He was another prisoner of history. With the end of the war and the communist victory in China, the Soviets decided to hand Puyi over to Mao Zedong's authorities. But instead of condemning him outright, the new regime saw another use for him, turning him into a symbol of communist re-education. Before that, however, he would have to answer to the court. In 1950, Puyi was tried for collaboration with Japan and for crimes committed during the puppet government. The trial was public, carefully staged to show the population that an era had come to an end. Before the judges, the former emperor appeared defeated, shrunken, fragile. There was no arrogance, no emphatic defense. He admitted everything, asked for forgiveness, claimed he had been manipulated. The image of the Son of Heaven shattered before thousands of eyes. He was no longer a man of thrones, scepters, or palaces. He was a defendant, admitting his mistakes and begging for a second chance. This was the moment when Puyi truly fell, not as an emperor, but as a myth. The trial marked the final point of his former identity. What remained now was the ordinary man, exposed before the world, trying to rewrite his story without crowns or titles. After the trial, Puyi was not executed, as many expected. Instead, he spent nearly a decade in a communist re-education camp. There, in the silence of the cells and the cold hallways, he traded the throne for a bucket, the court for forced labor, and imperial decrees for doctrine manuals. He was forced to confront the past, not with arrogance but with humility. Each day he wrote confessions, recalled memories, and reflected on his mistakes. Slowly, the figure of the emperor faded away, and the human being emerged, fragile, confused, but also more lucid. When he was finally released in 1959, Puyi was no longer recognized on the streets. Without titles, without fortune, without family, he became a simple gardener at the Beijing Botanical Garden. He trimmed flowers where he had once ordered executions. He swept leaves where he once paraded with armies. Slowly, he learned to live as an ordinary citizen, a cruel irony for someone born as the Lord of 10,000 years. It was during this final period of his life that Puyi wrote his memoirs. The book, titled From Emperor to Citizen, was more than an autobiography. It was an open letter to the world, not just about the fall of one man, but about the collapse of an entire empire. Puyi described the loneliness of the Forbidden City, the constant fear of making mistakes, the manipulation by the Japanese, and the emptiness that came with power without control. He spoke of shame, of regret, and of the bitter discovery that blind obedience, even when disguised as glory, had not saved him, only isolated him. In those pages, for the first time, Puyi was heard as a person, not as an emperor, not as a traitor, but as a man marked by choices and silences. It was his final attempt to understand his own life, and perhaps to be forgiven. The words that once came as decrees now came in a tone of lament, and it was in the act of writing that he finally left behind his most sincere letter. Puyi died in 1967 during the Cultural Revolution, with no honors, no state funeral, and no ceremony. But his story survived. A story that began in a golden cradle and ended with a gardening spade in his hand. A cycle closed by a memoir that still echoes as testimony of a China that no longer exists. Puyi's words were not just memories. They were a final gesture of humanity, from someone who had spent a lifetime not knowing what that truly meant. In the solitude of his memories, he left behind more than a letter. He left a portrait of an empire's fall, the fragility of power, and the slow redemption of someone who had been taught to rule, but never to feel. Among silent flowers and worn pages, the last emperor of China finally found his voice. Too late to change the past, but just in time to tell the truth. And as we read that lost letter, we no longer see the mythical figure on the throne, but the man behind the legend, broken, contradictory, real. Because in the end, some letters don't change fate, but they reveal who we truly were in the face of it.